The first artistic object of it is a show, a theater show called Nordicité. We did this show in collaboration with the Nordland Visual Theatre in Stamson. We stayed 2 months there and created the show. And it was an encounter because also we were working in northern Norway, but we were also working with a Finnish video creator. And Bente Andersson from Samovarteatret in Kirkenes also worked with us. So this was the first artistic object. And the second artistic object, we just finished it like a few seconds ago. It's a short movie that we did in very short period of time, 6 days. This is totally crazy. I don't recommend to anyone to do this. And it was with Russian artists, Norwegian artists, and Canadian artists. So this is mainly the two artistic objects that are now, and you can follow all the projects is on a web platform that will evolve during the years. So if you want, after you can come and get some information about it and follow it on the web.
Thank you, José. Ruud?
Hi, my name is Urt Johannessen, and I come from the Faroe Islands. And thank you very much for inviting me here. I think I'm the only representative from the Faroe Islands, and I'm happy to give the islands a voice. I work for Farelit, which is an abbreviation of Faroese literature. It's just me, part-time, it's really small scale. And the, if we can call it circumpolar related cooperation, it's within the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we do cooperate all the countries that have a public literary office, cooperate together in Nordlit, which is of course Nordic literature. And we meet at least twice a year, exchange good ideas and best practice. We administer the Nordic Translation and Production Fund, which is for Nordic publishers who want to translate and publish other Nordic literature. And then we do shared participation in book fairs around the world. We do shared projects like vis-a-vis the South Bank Center and the Nordic Matters project. And prior to my job in Farelit, I used to work in the Nordic House in the Faroe Islands, which is a cultural venue, both sort of producing and hosting all kinds of cultural projects and performances. And so my experience is very much within the sort of official Nordic rather than Arctic cooperation. So
we could talk later about how to broaden this collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. For years, the Anchorage Museum, for decades, I should say, was like many northern institutions where we really looked south for inspiration and for things to mimic and to import. So it was a few years ago, that we started programs to look at our place and our people, northern places and people, and we were interested in really revealing the complexities of the landscape and of people and languages and histories, and to take away that black and white imposed narrative that's often put on the Arctic. So we started this program called Polar Lab to foster these cross-sector collaborations in the Arctic that always included contemporary art as part of that ecosystem, and became motivated by working to offer a new narrative for the North, or a continued narrative for the North that really we represented in ownership of that narrative by the people that live in the Arctic. I mentioned in the last panel that there are now more than 24 reality television shows filmed in or about Alaska. So we felt this need to create an authentic narrative for our place and to connect Alaska to the rest of the Arctic, to take away the idea that of our own exceptionalism, our own provincial ideas of where we are in the world, and to make sure we were connecting with the rest of the globe to better understand ourselves. We've also been keenly interested in how to redefine a museum and what it means in a contemporary culture. So to move away from a focus simply on exhibitions and to become a convener, a host of conversations, to move away from that authoritative voice and to become a place that poses questions, to focus on multiple disciplines, multiple perspectives, multiple populations, and to become a community-driven identity that embraces Indigenous knowledge, design, and contemporary issues. So less of a looking back and more of a how do we matter to our community and how do we become part of this broader Arctic narrative.
Thank you. Jan?
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, thank you to Danielle to invite me to this panel. I'm the odd one out here. I'm, I believe, the only non-Arctic representative. As a panelist, it's a great honor and it's a big responsibility also. So we have been doing Arctic studies at our university for since 2010. I started an Arctic Research Center in the humanities at our university and also a Master's 2 program entirely taught in English, which has been running successfully since that time, open to anyone who has validated 4 years of higher education, no matter where they come from and what background they have. So the starting point for this was a connection with a great figure in French polar studies, Jean Mallory, who has written a very famous book about Greenland called The Last Kings of Thule in the 1950s, and who told me in conversation, I'm a professor of English literature and a specialist of travel writing, so we have a common ground, and who told me it would be wonderful if we had a master's program like that somewhere, which would be open both to French and European students, but also people from the Arctic, especially those who have trouble getting access to higher education, so we should try to think of a way of making this come alive. And why do it outside the Arctic? Because it might help some people to broaden their view and to be free also from some pressure that they might feel in their own environment from an institutional point of view. So that was the starting point, and we've been having students from France, obviously, but also elsewhere in Europe and across the world. I've just counted it. We've had so far students from 4 of the 8 Arctic countries, the US, Norway, Greenland and Russia. We have, to be circumpolar, established connections with universities and institutions across the Arctic, so we have regular contact with UQAM, and we have students from Yakutsk in Siberia coming every year. We've had Greenlanders because of a colleague at our university who specializes in Greenlandic studies. And so the aim from the start was to be as circumpolar as possible. And I'm also pleased to see that education, higher education, is present at this summit, because I think we have an important role as mediators to play, but that might be a comment to make a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm. I've been to this program, and I have to say, beside this summit where you have people from Russia, from Alaska, from Greenland that meet for a few days, I was very impressed in Versailles, where you have students staying 1 year together from Russia, from Greenland, and they really exchange and share ideas about this. I'll say a few words about Avatak Cultural Institute, even if it's not me, it's Robert Fréchette. So it is the only cultural institute by the Inuit. So it's governed by the elders of Nunavik, that's the territory of the Inuit in Quebec. So the elder decide everything inside this cultural institute. They produce publication, some traditional knowledge. And I've been working with them for many years now. I've been with Robert Fréchette to Yakutsk, which is also a native republic in Russia. And actually, when you see that how many similarities there is and how few links it exists, for example, between people in Siberia and Inuit, they have about the same problems, they have about the same asking to their government and so on. So there's a lot to do to get them together, but just the travel to go there and everything made us think that how difficult it is. We will talk about this in a second round, but all the programs are made either nationally or regionally, like Nordic Cooperation, but it's close to the Nordic in a European sense, it means Scandinavian mainly. So how do you break those policy rules to arrive to work together? So it includes translation, and translation is very expensive. It includes travel, and travel is extremely expensive. Usually I show a map of the plane connection in the Arctic, and it shows completely the colonial state of it. It is always north-south. If you want to go from Nunavik in Quebec to Nuuk, you have to do Kuujjuaq, Montreal, Frankfurt, Copenhagen, Kangerlussuaq, Nuuk. So you see that if someone thought of not having links in the circumpolar space, they work very well to do so. If we had a plane, probably it would save many of the connections that we need to have. So for myself at the University of Quebec and Montreal, so we try to make links between native and non-native communities in the Arctic. That's very important for us. So it includes translation. It includes breaking all the time the rules. We're working for the Faroe Islands, for example, and we see the limit of the rules that Faroe is almost independent, not completely independent. So Denmark and Faroe just bounce between each other, and we have difficulties of funding projects. So I guess you had the same difficulties that we had either with the students, with translation, with publication, or organizing events. So I worked in Greenland, and the Greenland writers told me it's very easy to go in the Nordic area, but then we want to go elsewhere too, and it's not possible. There's no program, no such program to make this circumpolar link. So maybe, no matter who begins, but just to tell us how did you manage to do those links without any programs to do so?
I have one example which is maybe interesting for everyone. We tried to bring in experts from Siberia to our university so that students and colleagues would have access to opinions that you usually don't access easily. So we have one of our anthropologists working with the Evenki people, and we try to find, well, there's French administration, but I mean there's administration in general, and then there are rules and so on and so forth. And I came up with the idea of expert. And suddenly there was no rule for experts, but there was no rule against them either. And we were able to bring in a reindeer herder from the Evenki people, and he's been working with Alexander, and they've just published a book together because she's very keen on co-construction of knowledge, which is a very important thing, to bring points of view together and draw on expertise of local communities. So that's one way, but then financing of that kind of action is very complicated. So if there would be a way of initiating programs to allow for this kind of exchange, would be extremely helpful, I think, for everyone.
So the first hint would be to play with the rhetoric of the program, when they call about something, to say that if someone with traditional knowledge maybe fit in a category that was not made for that. So tricking the programs could be one. Julie?
I suppose we're luckier in that we can define that for ourselves. What we've tried to do is include contemporary artists, indigenous knowledge in every program that we do, so that there's not a separation and a distinction made between how we look at the Arctic through different lenses. I think the idea that you expressed of traveling south to go north really struck me when I went to work with Siberia, and I went from Alaska to Dubai. And then to Siberia. We believe in that the only way to build understanding and greater awareness and to create this grassroots narrative of place is if people really embed themselves in communities. So we've seen a lot of short-term engagement in places like Alaska, where there's people come for 5 days or 2 weeks, and then they leave and they become a voice for our place. So what we've asked in the Polar Lab program is that we build relationships with people and with artists, and we ask for a 1 to 3 to multi-year engagement, so that we're not just building a relationship with them and offering value to the work that people do, but they're also establishing relationships with the communities and the people that live in the north, and a trust builds and an understanding grows, and soon it's a better and a shared narrative of place, and we start to take away the black and white definitions that so often get imposed upon our place. So we like to use a broad definition of art, a broad definition of design, a broad definition of experts, and to hopefully convene all of those ideas into one place and one idea. And I guess in the same way, we use a broad definition of the Arctic. So when we have artists in residence, that's not necessarily in Alaska, that's in residence throughout the Arctic. So wherever their research takes them, we hope to support what they're doing.
So in your case, it's more the museum that decide to be Arctic and then decide that the programs should be circumpolar, right?
Agreed.
Okay.
As for the Faroe Islands, it's a bit difficult. I think the artists themselves are much more in the forefront of cooperating and exchanging rather than the institutions and the political framework and the foundations. We're sort of, as you said, we're independent a bit, but not completely. We're not full members of the Nordic Council of Ministers, but we do participate. We're part of the Danish Kingdom, which is part of the EU, but we're not part of the EU. So there are lots of things, and what you said yesterday and what has been mentioned here is a lot to do with language and perception of concepts. If I should mention one project which has been really successful lately within literature in the Faroe Islands, it was called Islands and Literature. And there you have the place, islands, and the content, literature, bringing together writers from as far as Tasmania, Cape Verde, Antigua. And it just takes one person to have a really good idea and be able to sell it. Whereas when I looked into, I just did a small test, I put circumpolar into the search of the two Nordic cultural funds and no match found. So, I mean, it's a lot to do with the perception of the concepts, I think.
I think that the worst thing when you want to do such a project is that programs tends to be little boxes, and you can't fit in those little boxes. So you have to find a way to for us, how we managed to do this project was founded by the government, by the Canada, as an artistic work. And then, of course, we had a co-production with the Nordland Visual Theatre, and for the short movie, we had a participation from the Arctic Arts Summit. So we need to have partners, but we spend a lot of time to try to fix in those boxes. I think if we want to create ties between the circumpolar artists, we have to find a way to have programs that are long ahead planned. The worst enemy about time, taking time to meet other artists and to know about their identity and to be able to do the right thing, is those kind of pop-up programs. At one point you would have there's a new program to work with a Russian. Okay, I have 2 weeks to make a grant or to work with an Inuk. I don't want to work with an Inuk because he is Inuk. I want to work with an Inuk because I think that his artistic ways make an echo to mine, and we can grow together artistically. To do those things, you cannot work in a way that you have to be such in a rush to get money to do this and to get into boxes. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's well, I don't need. So one of the thing of this summit and one of the statement is that we should have more circumpolar relation. You can see that we managed to do it, but we can have very good ideas. That's our we produce idea, we produce relation and so on, but we don't produce the policy and so on. So how can we have them to change? Because of course this summit would be a success if all the government at the end would say, yes, we understand this and we will all have circumpolar programs to work all together, so the North will be linked in some way. Sometimes it's bilateral, sometimes it should be a multilateral. I know, for example, that the Quebec foreign policy just opened to the idea of Arctic and North, and that's a completely new. We are in the North since ever, but finally they say, oh, maybe we want link with those people around. So we've been doing this for years and years. So how do you change the policy from our level without being politicians? Because we need funding. We know that circumpolar relation will always be more expensive than other relation, because it includes, like I said, translation and transport. That's a fact. And life in the Arctic is, of course, more expensive than other places. So the money is not a secondary question. It's really at the core of cooperation and cultural cooperation. So maybe some ideas on how could we change the things. If we had ideas, if a minister would ask you, what should we do to reinforce this collaboration? And at which level it should be done?
In my point of view, it's really important to create a meeting fora for people. So it's very basic in my point of view, because I often, if I take myself and hope that I'm a bit like everybody else, ideas often occur in the meeting with other people and out of context of the everyday life, and sort of seeing how other people do arts or construct an artistic form. Or so I think meeting and mobility for people to meet. Of course, within some kind of framework, but yeah.
I think for a long time we've seen ourselves at a disadvantage, and we've kind of embraced that narrative. Like, if only we could be invited, if only we had grants, if only, then we'd be a part of this conversation. And I think we need to start sharing a narrative about recognizing that there's collaborations and convenings that are happening all the time, and that the greatest constant in the Arctic has been this exchange of people and ideas, and that policy often, as was mentioned yesterday, follows those collaborations. They can cross boundaries more easily. So I think we need to become better storytellers outside of our own field and our own universe, to really develop those cross-sector collaborations, and to build our own voice for why those matter. I think these conferences are important, but I think what's significant about this one is that we've invited people to the table. While we have long awaited to be invited to other tables, perhaps this is the table where we've invited policymakers to hear about what the art and culture sector does. I remember my first conversations with funders, speaking of dollars for Polar Lab, where I went to them and I said, we want to start this program and we have no idea what it is, and just bear with me, because I think that's what's important about it. Because we wanted room to grow relationships, to follow momentum, to allow it to be iterative, and to hope that the funders would invest in the travel and the connections, and then allow the products to grow out of that. So I think we need to stress how important it is that these connections are happening, that the collaborations occur, and that maybe not instantly, but over time, these incredible things grow out of them. So for me, it's about building that narrative, a shared narrative for the Arctic, but also a shared narrative for how arts and culture are a pretty embedded part of that ecosystem, along with business and industry and science.
Well, yes, maybe a little bit from the point of view of higher education. Well, first of all, I think it's very important to put art, as it is stated here, or art and culture, I'd agree, on the political agenda as an important factor to take into consideration, as something to take serious. That's very important. At our university, in the Arctic Studies program, we work in an interdisciplinary way with a very strong team of climatologists, among top-ranking institutions in the world, and it's not easy to engage in a dialogue, but we've been doing it for a number of years, and they agree that the societal impact of what they're doing is an important issue, and they agree that cultural approaches to these questions are also important to take into account. So there are politicians present here, so it is an important way to show that you need to take this into consideration in any kind of decision-making process. In higher education, we have programs to support initiatives to make young people study science, because that's what we need. They call it STEM education, but they now speak sometimes of STEAM education. It's a little bit blurry to me. But there is the A in it, and it stands for the arts. So it's a kind of timid initiative to show that we need to also take this into consideration. As to suggestions how to make things come alive more easily, I think the dialogue is the key notion in what is needed amongst, well, circumpolar nations, that's one thing, but between the circumpolar regions of the world and the rest of the world. So in order to stimulate dialogue, people need to meet. It's not enough to have Skype meetings and video conference. Of course, we have tools in Europe, for instance. The pity that the European ambassador is not in the room right now, but they are sometimes not adapted to the needs of people working, if I may say so, in the humanities or social science. What we need is occasions to meet relatively briefly. Of course, we need also sometimes long stays where people do field work, but we also need tools so that we can organize meetings on a short-term basis, because we're all very busy and engaged in many things, and we don't have time, unfortunately, to spend months and months elsewhere. So if I'm thinking of some of the European programs like Marie Curie, they're not really adapted to this, because they tend to finance longer stays, and we would need short stays, short mobility, 1 week, 2 weeks, that would be ideal.
I could also see an idea in creating residencies and visiting artist residencies within the areas, the local areas, because I, again, am very much a believer in good things happening from actual meetings between people. And I think the little story that Kristin Danielsen from the Art Council Norway told yesterday about Maria Utsi coming for a meeting with this idea, and it took her 10 seconds to sort of sell it. And it just shows that sometimes the actual meeting between people is necessary to promote an idea. And of course you need a good idea and the good arguments to get the politicians on board.
I think we're all convinced that ideas precede everything, and when you have a good idea, you will find funding and you will find collaboration, that's sure. But Jan was telling something about the other Arctic Summit, because it's the first summit that put the culture at the center of it. But there's many summits about the Arctic, and it's something we didn't address here. All the attention right now on the Arctic is by people in science and environmental studies, and culture is like, when it's there, it's the last thing that counts. And it's also a debate that we have to defend ourselves as culture and linguistic aspect as something very important. And the barrier is greater. We see it on the academic level than you can think of. We get almost nothing in the attention, and we think that culture and human aspect are the first and foremost in the Arctic territory, but I think we are alone sometimes to think about those aspects, and it's very important. The other thing that we have to see is that we have artists, academics, and cultural institutions. And of course, the artists produce work, they are the core of our work, and the institution have dissemination and conservation, but also the academics that play a different role, but we also disseminate, we teach those work, we integrate corpus inside what will be the future artists and future people. So it's a chain that we have to keep together, I think, to understand clearly what's at stake. And you mentioned another thing about geographic ensemble. Of course, we live in similar and non-similar, and I see that some collaboration are very easy. Like for me, it's very easy to work with Scandinavia. We have the same programs. The state fund clearly the programs for 3 years, for 2 years. We ask, it's very honest the way it is, and we get the money or not, but it's state made. There's European Union that might be interesting in some points, because they say they want to collaborate with the other. We'll see what they have really on hand. And on the other side, you have Russia that has its own program, but we are not very aware because of linguistic difference about those programs. So the collaboration, even in Russia, is the real diversity of the Arctic. Connection are not always easy, and then you have US that have different programs, not state programs, that are very different in their way to function. So those ensembles also make barriers, I would say, between collaboration.
I was just going to say that the arts find themselves on two sides of a spectrum often. Either we're dangerous, so we're not invited, or we're decoration, and we're invited to be off to the side and
Which
to
is
provide
worse?
I think I'll take dangerous. So as a museum, we've been trying to invade the conferences in a new way and invite ourselves to be part of the conversations rather than to offer the exhibition off to the side or the performance at the break, and to put this at the table. So I think, again, if we can find the space in between, that gray area, to talk about how in so many ways we help give voice to the rest of that conversation, to give visuals to the data, to find the human element and all of those things in between. And the more we can demonstrate that, I think the more funding and the UN and policy might follow. So, yeah.
Yes, I think also from the point of view of creating an artwork, what I can say was what was one of the difficulty is to go behind cliches. It is very, very absolutely difficult to make a work, an artistic work that talks about the North, because somehow we are everybody's cliches, and you get at a point as an artist that you're like, okay, I cannot talk about what they wear or how they, like you get scared, and this cuts the conversation. I believe that we really need programs and organizations that are set in time. We need a first meeting when we talk, where we talk together, and we need a second meeting where we listen what the other was saying. And this is really important. And then we need a third meeting to do not necessarily an artwork that is based on the final project or the result, but some research, some things that you connect together. We've been doing this lately, this short movie, and it's really a way of just, okay, you do this kind of work. How do you create? How do you express yourself? And then I respond to this, and then, we make this encounter. And these research part, these residencies based on time is really important. And I think if the programs would be like 3 years program, you would have like a first year you meet, the second year your residency and you do research, and the third year maybe you do a project, final artistic project. But it's really based on time for me.
So if I hear you, and we said that in the curator session just before, it's personal contact that are needed, even if we are in an era where you can connect easily through internet and through social media. Actually, physical, normal meeting are really needed to understand.
It's essential. Yes.
It's an important message also to say, because usually they say, why do you travel? Why do you have to go? And actually the real meeting with someone can convince in 10 seconds someone to a good idea, but also to understand all the other aspects. We have some time for 1 or 2 questions, if you, yes?
Just ask a question. My name is Katerina Shvarova. I'm
Maybe stand up. Oh, the micro too.
Does it work?
No, you have to stand up for the voice.
No, I just wanted to ask about Russia, because you have been naming Yakutsk, and I'm originally from Arkhangelsk, and after working for 13 years in Norway, I've been working now in Russia for 2 years, and it's a kind of surprising to see that despite the rich cultural scene, the Russian national Park Russian Arctic Federal University in Arkhangelsk, Murmansk Arctic University, rich art scene and the Arctic Art Forum I've been curating is not represented here for some reason. And I've been also visiting exhibitions, and I have never found any Russian representative, so I just wonder why. And what do you think about it?
Mm-hmm. Someone want? Thank you. Who wants to answer to that? Did you work with Russia before the?
Yeah, I think there are incredibly strong connections throughout decades between Alaska and Russia. At times when there was an embargo on an exchange of objects and airplanes, there was an exchange of people and ideas. I think a lot of people talk about how that helped warm the Cold War and to create those connections. I've seen Russia at the table at a lot of international conferences. I'd like to see it more at the arts and culture conversation as well. I think Russia just took the chairmanship of IASA, the International Association of Social Science, something. So I think there's a great interest in reaching out and sharing. And I think there's great interest in usurping politics on that level and making sure that people are connecting even when our governments are not.
But one aspect is also the linguistic difficulties, and often working with Russian would imply translation, so it adds a level of difficulty to the relation and, of course, the funding of it.
Just comment, because you're naming Yakutsk, and Yakutsk is actually in Siberia, and the gateway to the Arctic is Arkhangelsk and Murmansk.
Mm-hmm.
And in Arkhangelsk there was a big forum in March, in the end of March, with the president of Finland, president of Iceland present, president of Russia present, and ministries from other Nordic countries. And I've been curating a forum last year in September where we had a representative from Anchorage Museum, which was very exciting. Sweden, Finland, but it's surprising that there is so little knowledge about that.
Mm-hmm.
So you are welcome to Arkhangelsk and Murmansk.
Thank you. Other question or comments? Or among yourself? No? Some last comments, maybe?
Russian connection, there are many activities with Russian partners, and I have been myself to Arkhangelsk, so I'm very well received. But we work with Yakutsk for historical reasons, because colleagues had contacts there. It's one of the federal universities, as you know, so it's one of the privileged partners to work with, and they also have a very strong presence in the University of the Arctic network, and Russian universities are in general very well represented in there. So I don't know about this event, but of course, whenever you're dealing with circumpolar issues, you just simply must have Russians. That's normal. I'm not sure that in Europe this is always something that people are aware of, because there are political implications in setting up funding, and right now we have a bit of a problem at that level with Russian partners. And for Arctic projects, that's a problem, because we need Russian partners. They're not funded automatically.
We have to be very, very tight on time, so we have to stop here and continue the conversation after. Of course, we talk about nation. I really don't like when people talk about 8 nations of the Arctic. There's actually many cultures of the Arctic, and I think we should work on a cultural level and not imply political level at this thing, because in each of the what they call nation, there's many culture, many languages, and so on. And I think the connection can be sometimes between culture instead of being between nation. It's much more efficient, I'm sure.
I would have a last thing to add. We are presenting our short movie now in the blue auditorium, and we will present it if you are interested.
So they can eat while we can eat while watching.
No, it's just in the blue auditorium, but it's 9 minutes, so you have time to.
One last thing I also want to if you're interested in Faroese literature and beyond that, please feel free to take one of these catalogs.
So thank you for the participant. Thank you to you for this session.